The following is a presentation of Geekster Media.
Remember that show back then? Remember that show? Turn on the TV, time was always flying. Why did they have to end? So many shows you forgotten. Now that we've got a podcast, we can release all the shows from our hands. Yeah, will you be the most TV dudes you'll ever listen to? As long as we keep on talking sitcoms and cartoons from back in the day. Okay, we confess we're obsessed, but we got a podcast to help you remember that show. Hey there, TV lovers, and welcome to episode 9 of Remember That Show, the podcast where we revisit the obscure or forgotten TV shows of the 80s and 90s. This time around, we're traveling back in time to witness the birth of a new network and examine the flagship show that carried this fledgling programming block through the first 5 years of its broadcast history.
But before we get into that, it's time to take you back to our own early days of TV obsession in a segment we call Theme Song. Families, conventional or otherwise, have always been at the center of sitcoms that managed to secure the highest ratings in prime time. Whether it was Leave It to Beaver, The Brady Bunch, All in the Family, The Cosby Show, The Simpsons, or Home Improvement, most viewers were ready to tune in for some laughs in a domestic setting. For some, these shows even provided a connection to a family life they never had. So Adam, who is your favorite TV family?
Yeah, I was really racking my brain on this one. I was just like, so many choices, but I've settled, surprisingly, on the Russos from Blossom. I thought they were pretty awesome because they each had their own things going on in their lives, but then they were all there for each other. It wasn't like everything we do is together. It's like, no, they were living, the experiences they needed to live, but it was not in a full house teaching moment kind of way that they were connecting. It was always through full disclosure and honesty eventually in the story. It was that kind of like Nick, he was a cool dad. He understood boundaries, but then he wasn't afraid to actually parent when it was necessary. And it wasn't like he was written to be stupider than his kids, like most sitcom dads are. Like he was pretty together. Tony, he's recovering from his addictions. He had legitimate concerns about relapsing, but he was making it work, and he could still play the older brother to Blossom and Joey. He knew the pitfalls of adult life, and he had that experience, and he would share that with them. And then Joey was stupid, but he was there for his family when they needed him. He was not like, just super flighty. And of course, Blossom, she's going through all the teen girl stuff. It's about her. She's probably the smartest one in the family, but she was always still willing to learn about life. And that's why she wasn't like she had it all figured out. She was willing to say, you know what? Okay, let me see what these people that I trust have to say. So they were just a solid family unit, and I loved that.
Okay, that's a good one. I never would have even thought of them. I was racking my brain too, and I was trying to think of not the Tanner family, be it Alf or Full House. Not the Winslows, none of that. I'm a big fan, because we're saying conventional or otherwise, I'm a big fan of the finding your family trope. It's like you might not necessarily be related by blood, but you kind of make your own family unit. There are a lot of different examples of it, but the one that sticks out to me, I'm a big TNBC fan. For a lot of people who don't know, TNBC was the name of NBC's Saturday morning block once Saved by the Bell ended, but then they had all these Peter Engel shows. So Saved by the Bell, A New Class, California Dreams, and one that no one ever talks about is City Guys. And City Guys starts in this whole thing of you've got the black kid who's from the inner city and he's kind of struggling and his dad owns the diner. And then you've got the rich white kid who he's getting kicked out of prep schools because he's just kind of irresponsible, but he's got promise. And then they end up in the same school together and they start out as enemies, but then by the end of the series, they're basically brothers. There was the local bully, kind of like the Bulk and Skull situation. His name was Lionel, but they called him L Train. And in in the beginning, he's like this like menacing like gang leader, and by the end, he's just like dopey Lionel. He's just wacky Lionel, you know? So it's like, yeah, they kind of neutered him, but I like how by the end of that show, and I mean, it happens a lot in teen shows because that whole like they choose their family because like these are the people who get me and they're on my level. They're not like mom and dad. And like, I don't know, those always kind of like jump out at me.
Yeah, those are great. I mean, and some of the families you mentioned, like when you bring up the Winslows or people like that, it's like there are these families that are revered in television. The Cunninghams, like from Happy Days, like they all abandoned children in their families. They just set them off without any mention. That was an epidemic in sitcoms.
There's a limit. There's a limit. They were like, nope, that's one kid too many.
That being the case, though, what we're here to talk about tonight is the WWWB, and there were a whole bunch of families on that network at one point or another. But we're going to find out what was going on in television in the mid 90s that allowed the WB and all its shows to get the green light. So the idea behind the launch of the WB network is fascinating, really in its simplicity. In 1987, the Fox network launched as the fourth television network. They were competing with ABC and NBC and CBS that had been around for decades. But Fox arrived with a full schedule of sitcoms. They had Married with Children. They had highbrow sketch comedy by Tracy Ullman. They had the sexy teen cop drama 21 Jump Street and a bunch of other stuff you've never heard about that we're eventually going to talk about or have talked about already. But by 1994, Fox was a juggernaut. They had created cultural phenomenons many times over. The Simpsons, Beverly Hills 90210, In Living Color, Martin, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. I mean, that's just a few. There were so many popular shows on Fox. So I feel like it was with that idea in mind that a bunch of castaway executives from the Fox network who had been there to usher in all that success, they now were following the same model that they had successfully used in the 80s to create a fifth network in the 90s that would now compete with Fox for ratings dominance. So just as Fox was backed by 20th Century Fox Studios, among other groups, this network would have the production power of Warner Brothers Studios behind it to make the debut of the WB a well-publicized affair with a recognizable name. So, Will, do you think the public was ready for or even expecting a fifth network at this time?
See, I don't think the public was necessarily ready for a fifth network in the sense that we actually got to it once. Like, people forget that the WB only launched 5 days prior to UPN. So we were getting their marketing all at the same time. And even though the WB is technically number 5, you'd be hard pressed to find a random guy on the street who knew that, you know? So it's like, while we kind of had an idea of what we were getting from the WB with the backlot hangouts with the casts of the new shows, like even if you hadn't heard of any of those things, you're still like, oh, it's that guy. It's the DJ from In Living Color, that kind of deal. Like UPN was kind of mysterious. A lot of that was because they were scrambling for shows up until launch day. So the UPN marketing fell back on the Paramount pedigree. There was like an orchestra and they're singing about like all of the shows that Paramount has produced up until that point. Plus, its flagship show was a new network-based Star Trek series. So honestly, I was more excited for UPN than the WB at the time, but we were getting ready for both whether we wanted them or not. How about you?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like, when I was thinking about that time, there was already a ton of cable networks that had really proliferated, you know, in the early 90s, and they were creating original programming. You know, you had stuff like Silk Stockings and Pacific Blue on the USA Network, or all the Snick shows on Nickelodeon. MTV had Beavis and Butthead and The State and all the, you know, eventually getting in their reality TV stuff. So it felt like there was no end to what you could do on TV now, because it was just like everywhere you turned, there was a new channel and you wanted to watch something on it. So I think our brains as viewers were totally open. We were ready for new shows on any station. Like, it didn't seem strange that something was going to pop up. We wanted to be flipping channels and not just see an old rerun of I Love Lucy, you know, like we had seen that for years. So it was definitely like the right time, I feel like, to be launching a new network.
Talking about that launch, then let's get into the fact that the WB network launched in January 1995 with 4 shows. The first to air was The Wayans Brothers, starring Sean and Marlon Wayans, the younger brothers of In Living Color creator Heenan Ivory Wayans. The second was The Parenthood, created by Robert Townsend, which played like a hipper version of The Cosby Show. The third was a strange comedic parody of soap operas called Muscle, starring actors like Alan Ruck and Nestor Carbonell, that was the first to be canceled. The fourth show to premiere was an unconventional family sitcom called Unhappily Ever After, which is what we're here to discuss tonight. Married with Children had been the surprise hit that put Fox on the map in 1987, so the WB executives asked the co-creator of that series, Ron Levitt, to catch lightning in a bottle again by creating a nearly identical sitcom for their network. Did it work? Well, the show lasted for 5 seasons until 1999, as did the Wayans brothers, so they must have been doing something right. But we'll get into the details of that show shortly. Adam, what are your memories of the WB launch and the early shows that appeared on the network?
Oh man, I mean, you mentioned UPN, and UPN, the only thing I knew about UPN back in the day, because I wasn't a Star Trek fan, I was just like, oh, Moesha, that's their big show. So like UPN was happening, and I was like, I don't know about this. But the WB, like on our local affiliate, which is KTLA 5, I remember Michigan J. Frog dancing with his top hat and his cane. There's all these teaser promos. They're telling us that it's on the way. So I was there from the beginning. In fact, it's funny, like the Michigan J. Frog promo, a few years later, that was the intro for our high school talent show. They played that video before it all started because it was like a salute to Hollywood type thing. So it was just kind of funny. But I tuned into all the launch shows except for Muscle. Like I have zero recollection of that ever existing, but I was a big fan of In Living Color. So anything the Wayans family was doing, like I saw Blank Man in the theater. I wasn't old enough to see, Mo Money or anything like that. But but then I was also on board for the Parenthood because I loved the Meteor Man movie and I saw it in theaters, and that's all I knew Robert Townsend from. So I was like, oh, he has a sitcom now, I'm gonna watch that. And then what's funny though is the second wave is what really caught my attention, because there was Cleghorn exclamation point starring Ellen Cleghorn. It was so strange because I only knew her, I watched SNL, but I must have missed her era. But I had these compilation videos I got at Suncoast. I was like, oh, it's that girl from Saturday Night Live. And then I started thinking, I was like, really? She was like a glorified featured player, and that's who you're coming out of the gate with? Okay. And then there was Kirk, which is the most boring show ever, with the no longer cool Kirk Cameron. And then I remember when they tried the primetime soap opera Savannah, which I only watched for like 1 or 2 episodes because I still had a crush on Jamie Luner from Just the 10 of Us. So I was like, okay, never mind. No, it's not for me. And then aside from Unhappily Ever After, the only series I thought was truly great and I watched like for most of its seasons was the Jamie Foxx show. I love that cast. And again, the In Living Color connection, that's what initially hooked me. But like by 2000, I had checked out of the network. I remember they premiered the sitcom, you might recall. It was called Movie Stars, about these Hollywood actors raising their kids. And I'm just like, no, this is nothing. But apparently Dinah Manoff directed a couple of those episodes. I was
Really?
unaware. Yeah, I was looking it up. I was like, huh. Then the only thing that could have kept me watching the WB was the Nikki Cox solo series just called Nikki, where she was like living in Vegas and she's a showgirl and her husband's a pro wrestler. And I was like, this has oh no, it's pretty bad. Okay. I'm
Yeah,
not going to keep
yeah.
watching this. All right. Well, and then I never got on board with the teen dramas, that led into the CW era. So Dawson's Creek only got my attention because the star of the 1990 The Flash series, John Wesley Shipp, is his dad. And then I stopped watching. And then Smallville didn't even hook me. I didn't even give that a chance. So the whole vibe of pretty people with relationship problems, that just never appealed to me. So then I was out. What
I
about
hear you.
you, though? I'm so curious. I'm sure there's some I haven't mentioned that you really remember.
I'm kind of there with you. The weird thing about like UPN and WB was like their expansion strategy. They targeted certain owned stations. So like a lot of the stations that became the WB stations were owned by like Tribune Broadcasting. And what happened there was a lot of those channels didn't do jack before the WB existed. In DC, it was Channel 50. Before the WB, Channel 50 was an infomercial channel. Every now and then, they might run like reruns of Out of This World or something, but it wasn't even the channel that like syndicated shows ended up on. It was pretty much 80% infomercials all day. It had a terrible signal. So like when I found out the WB was going there, I was like, that's a terrible idea. Like we can't even get that channel. But like they boosted the signal, everything. But I don't know if they were loosey-goosey because it was a launch or they kind of were lax with the stations because they were basically like UHF stations converted. But I remember in the beginning, there was no real set schedule. Even though it was these 4 shows, you could turn on channel 50 at basically like any time of day. And it's like, here's 2 hours of the Wayans brothers. Here's 2 hours of Unhappily Ever After. They ran it almost like those hotel channels, you know, and they're just telling you about like the hotel bar and the gift shop. And it's just on a loop. So it's like you could jump into the loop and hop in on a show at any point in time. And like since it was so new, like the TV listings, because we didn't do TV Guide, we did like TV Week, which came in the Washington Post. Like it couldn't keep up with what was going on. It's still showing us that like all these televangelists and like infomercials were coming on. So it was kind of a surprise. It was like a sitcom jukebox. And I mean, most of those shows were decent and lasted. You can't have a conversation about any launch UPN shows that were not Voyager because a lot of people, there's a great book out there if anybody's interested. It's called Season Finale, The Rise and Fall of UPN and the WB. And it recounts how they were formed and what was going on as they're racing to the air. And UPN was so desperate for shows, they started rummaging through the cast-offs that NBC didn't want for pilot season. So that's where like Homeboys and Out of Space came from, and those shows where it's like the show was done, but like NBC didn't want it. So they're like, yeah, we'll take it. We need something on the air, but they're all forgettable. WB launched with like a pretty good footprint that like you still remember those shows to this day. But my biggest memory is how it was constantly on a loop. So it's like I would watch like 4 hours of Wayans Brothers. Then it's like 4 hours of Unhappily, and it was just a weird mini marathon all the time.
Yeah, I mean, that was the thing. I mean, Unhappily, again, we're here to talk about that in detail. The only thing I'll just mention about the first like 2-3 seasons of that show was it got so popular, especially with me and my friends because of Nikki Cox, that my buddy actually got to go to a taping because their family friend was the youngest son on Dave's World on that sitcom. And so he had like connections in the industry, and so they got to go and see a taping. I remember he came back with an Unhappily Ever After t-shirt with Mr. Floppy on it, and I was just like, you didn't meet Nikki Cox, did you? He's like, I did. I was like, no! I was so mad. And so like that was like I'd never been so jealous in my life. And so like that was the big thing for us, was just to talk about Unhappily Ever After, talk about Nikki Cox, and and Wizard Magazine always had her in there for their casting calls and stuff. Like she was becoming a big deal. We'll get into that more, but that was just what I remember is Unhappily really had a real presence like out there in the world. Like it really caught people's attention. But then as the WB continued, also you were talking about kind of these cast-off shows. Like I remember Sister Sister got canceled. Then it ends up over there, and then their little brother gets his own sitcom, Smart Guy, right? And then Brotherly Love with the Lawrence brothers gets canceled. Then it goes over there, right? So it's just kind of funny to see how they would just, okay, we'll have you for one more season. Okay, nobody's watching still. Okay, then you're done with.
Right.
But like I said, we got to talk about Unhappily. We got to tell people if they've forgotten by now what it was all about. So let's get to our elevator pitch. Unhappily Ever After told the story of a suburban family, the Malloys, who were dealing with the separation and imminent divorce of the parents. A depressed used car salesman named Jack, played by Jeff Pearson, and unfaithful materialistic housewife Jenny, played by Stephanie Hodge. Now, their children were the sweet young Ross, at least at the beginning, played by Justin Burfield, dim-witted Ryan, played by Kevin Connolly, and their selfish, ambitious, and impossibly attractive daughter, Tiffany, played by Nikki Cox. Now, in the first episode, Jack moves out of the house and into a grungy apartment complex where his only companion is the stuffed bunny rabbit, Mr. Floppy, who, due to Jack's delusional mind, comes to life as his only companion, and he's voiced by Bobcat Goldthwait. Now, also in the mix during the first 2 seasons were Jenny's pill-popping mother, Maureen, played by Joyce Van Patten, who acted as the stereotypical nagging mother-in-law to Jack. And then there were other, like, kind of supporting friends of Tiffany's that managed to kind of exist throughout most of the series after that as well. But, Will, just to start here, the comparisons to Married with Children immediately come to mind. They were there from the beginning. Everybody would talk about that. But do you consider Unhappily Ever After a ripoff of Married with Children?
No, not at all. I definitely don't consider Unhappily a Married ripoff. Because you see, for all the criticism the Bundys got over the years, at the end of the day, you knew they still cared for each other. That's one of the things that Moy talked about in that 4-hour interview we mentioned in the She's With Me episode. His issue was that you can infer that sitcom families love each other without a sappy declaration of it. And to me, that was always apparent when the Bundys would get into fights with other families. Like, they had each other's backs. Like, my 80-year-old grandmother, she loved that show, but her favorite episodes were when the Bundys would get into fights, whether it was in like traffic jams or in the supermarket or wherever. Like, that's when they really came together. And then one thing I always pointed out to like Married with Children naysayers was that like Al may have been unhappy, but he never cheated and he never left. And I don't think he gets enough credit for that. Like, people are like, well, that's what he's supposed to do. But we see that he could have gone a different way. And that's why, like, to me, Unhappily is like a multiversal remix of Married with Children, because you start with the same ingredients, but they put a different spin on it. Like, Jack Malloy basically got Al's wish in that he did get to leave his annoying, conniving wife. This time, the daughter was hot and smart. There were some subtle and not so subtle changes, but there's certainly Levitt DNA in the show, but I don't think it's fair to either show to compare them so closely.
Yeah, I mean, the vibe is very much the same, as you say, as far as like a dysfunctional family setup. Okay, but despite sitting on a couch, I think, for most of his scenes that are the focus on Jack Malloy, he is much more capable than Al Bundy. You can tell he's a little sharper, but his mind has cracked due to being beaten down by married life and everything. And Jenny is much more devious than Peggy ever was, right? Peggy is like selfish and lazy. That's different, you know? Tiffany is way more clever, like you said. She's smarter, but she's more ambitious than Kelly, and she doesn't devolve into a moron over the course of the series. Like, she's always smart. She goes to Harvard by the last episode. I mean, that's where she's at. Ryan does become more swarthy by the final season. Like, he's much more tried to be a Lothario. He's more kind of grungy, but he's a different kind of stupid than Bud Bundy is. You know, he's not a schemer like Bud was. He's just hyper and impulsive most of the time.
He's horny.
Yeah, he's horny, yeah. And then, you know, Ross is Ross. I mean, Ross is not 7, I guess, or I guess that's how it goes. When I just like break it down, I'm like, the Malloys are middle class jerks who are in it for themselves, while the Bundys are like one step above white trash who ultimately end up looking out for each other in the end, always, like you said. So
it was also interesting with Justin Berfield's character. You mentioned that he's kind of like a serial killer, because that was reportedly the original plan for Bud Bundy. And the only reason it didn't stick was, first of all, it was decided pre-Faustino, like, because we talked about how the casting changed. But also, Moy feared that a character like that would require some kind of reckoning, because looking back on the show that they did with original Steve Rhodes and Justin Bateman, It's Your Move, the recipe of that show was that each character gave as good as they got. So it's like you got David Garrison and Justin Bateman going back and forth. Well, they felt that if you have a crazy kind of like serial killer psychopathic character, it has to pay off at some point. You can't just let that run, which was an interesting viewpoint, because I think a lot of shows have just let that character run, but he thinks it's not fair to the audience. So without wanting to commit to ramping it up and eventually dealing with it, they just took it away from the character.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, because like even with Ross, at the beginning, Ross is just kind of like the one who clearly sees what's going on when everybody's scheming. He's just like, but what about this? And they're like, shut up, Ross, like type of
Right,
thing.
right.
And then, but then just as he progresses, then he's like, someday, there's gonna be a problem because I'm gonna do this to you. Like he starts threatening people more often. So,
Right,
but
right.
yeah, let's get a little bit farther into this series here.
Well, throughout the 5 seasons of the show, the family schemes against one another, mock each other's intelligence, and bicker constantly. Jack and Jenny have an on-again, off-again relationship, mostly fueled by Jenny's jealousy at Jack dating other women or desiring to get more money out of him. As the show progressed, the star power of Nikki Cox became the driving force of Unhappily, and storylines focused more on Tiffany's adventures in trying to maintain her academic and social standing in school, while Ryan gets involved in one stupid situation after another. But the breakout star of the show was by far Bobcat Goldthwait as the punk rock puppet Mr. Floppy. He viciously mocked celebrities and constantly declared his love for Drew Barrymore while acting as a sounding board for Jack's problems. The character was even the star of the closing credits, where he would get his own segment in which he answered viewer mail. Adam, if the show lasted for 5 seasons, why do you think it qualifies for discussion on our podcast?
Well, I mean, the thing is, as much as we're saying like this was big in the moment and people knew about it, like it hasn't remained in the public consciousness. And I think it's because, with the exception of Kevin Connolly ending up on Entourage and becoming a big deal from that, like when you Google Unhappily now or Nikki Cox, the only thing that comes up is Kevin Connolly telling the story of how they were dating when the show started, and she dubbed him for Bobcat Goldthwait, who she then stayed with, forever after that. So like that's all that comes up for this show. And you have Justin Burfield had a good run on Malcolm in the Middle as another kind of crazy young man. But the cast, other than that, hasn't really done anything of note. Like Nikki Cox faded out of the spotlight. She got married to Jay Moore and she decided to focus on comedy writing. They're divorced now. So I'm like, where is she? And like I said, she was with Bobcat Goldthwait for many years afterwards, but he hasn't really even done anything besides he'll direct like a real black comedy movie that nobody watches, and there's no DVD release. It's not streaming. I mean, the whole series is on YouTube. That's how we watched it, but other contemporary WB shows like the Jamie Foxx show, that's on Max. Like you could just watch it. So it's got to have something to do with the fact that it was produced by Touchstone Television, which is a division of Disney, and maybe they don't want it out there. There's got to be some legal or just content issue, which we may get into as we continue our discussion. What about you, though? What do you think? Is there a reason we don't hear about it more often?
We'll probably get into it in jeers, but it hasn't aged well.
Yeah.
And I say that as like, what is this? This is episode 9. By this point, y'all probably know, like, I am not a good person. I have a good heart, but I laugh at bad things. And I was watching this show and thinking like, ooh, this did not age well. And it takes a lot for me to say that.
All right. Well, fair enough. So before we get into our cheers, though, we have to get into our cheers. So, Will, what is the special sauce of this show? Why did people laugh? Why did people watch it?
I think it put its stamp on the WB the same way Mary did for Fox. As far as comedy goes, it was the strongest WB sitcom for years, but the problem is that's not what the network was really going for. They wanted to be embraced for all their youth skewing programming, like we'd get Dawson's Creek and all those other shows, and they would become known for their pretty teen dramas and not for their sitcoms. So similarly, I feel WB was just as ashamed of Unhappily as Fox was of Married. The show always seemed like it was treated like an afterthought. People don't remember, like, when networks start, they don't start full week schedules. Like the WB had the quote unquote new Tuesday night for a decade. So it was a gradual like rollout. So like when the WB started, they only had like 3 nights a week. But I remember Unhappily, like at least near the end, it was closing out Sunday nights. It was kind of like, here's this other stuff we kind of think will work, but oh yeah, don't forget, here's Unhappily. But they promoted it the same they did their other shows. They got to hang out on the back lot. They had Michigan J-Pop with the WB. me. So it's like they were treated like family a little better than Married was, but it felt like the WB didn't want that to be their identity, but they still kind of like survived and thrived in spite of that. And there were just different things about it that I think is why we remember it. For example, comedian Ant played Tiffany's openly gay best friend. And TV didn't do that back then. Like if they did, it was like Will and Grace gay. You know, it's like, oh, he's a buttoned up conservative lawyer and he just happens to like guys, but don't tell anybody. Because in fact, I don't know if you saw this recently, there was like the original promo for Will and Grace was floating around where NBC had cut it to just make it look like Will and Grace were best friends, but best friends and former lovers, which is true, but so it was that kind of thing. So the Ant thing always stuck out to me. A lot of people got their starts there that you would notice later. Kristana Loken, I would have bet the farm on her for going far. And I mean, she ends up in like Xena, and then she ends up later on in Terminator 3, and then she becomes Painkiller Jane. And you're like, come on, you're almost there. You're going to be a big deal. And it just didn't work out. But I still, like, when I see her, I'm like, oh yeah, you were Sable in Unhappily Ever After, you know? So it's just kind of like, I think it was just really of its time, the same way that like Married was. Like Married is very 80s and early 90s. It hits a point where it stops evolving with time. So it's that Fox time capsule. Unhappily is very much a mid-90s show in terms of like the pop culture it references, in terms of what it gets away with, which is kind of why I think it's not spoken of now. If you liked edgy and like I was the perfect age for that, as the kids would say, it goes harder than Married with Children. These like parent councils and everything thought they had found something bad with Married with Children, and they ain't seen nothing yet. You know?
Yeah, it's like The
But
Simpsons to South Park. It's 100%
exactly.
that same thing. And like to your point, you know, what you always bring up, Will, is that we're too smart as a television watching audience now, right? And this is the kind of show that educated viewers about meta storytelling, but just in an entertaining, outrageous way. Like Mr. Floppy, he's constantly breaking the fourth wall to talk to the audience and address the celebrities that they're mocking with their jokes. Like they just talk directly to screen. And especially like by the fourth season, they're literally just attacking tropes of TV sitcoms and pointing them out. Like there's an episode where Jack starts giving advice to Tiffany and she's like, no, Dad, that's a Ross episode. We're not doing that this week, you know? Or, you know, like the whole idea with Ross, we talked about the serial killer stuff. So the parents are watching this violent TV show and he comes in and sees it and he says, I'm going to kill my parents now. And then they flash a phrase, social satire on the screen multiple times, obviously because legal department thought the audience is not going to get this joke, right? So like, do not do that. Okay, we got to tell them. I don't even think we mentioned this yet, but Jenny becomes a ghost. The mom dies in the fourth season, and then when that happens, a network executive literally comes in through the door, an actual executive, and they introduce him as being from the mighty WB, and then he declares that they have to resurrect the dead mom because it's scaring them, and then Ryan says, I guess you know best, and then the executive responds, that's why we're number 5. Just like they're so in on it. Quite a few times, they acknowledge that people are only tuning in to look at Nikki Cox. Like Jack and Ryan have a scene in a basement and they're just, you know, in the basement set. And then eventually they say, she hasn't been on screen for a few minutes. We better get upstairs before we lose any more viewers. Like there's a fantasy sequence where Ryan imagines what would happen if Tiffany died. And it has the audience hooting and hollering as he walks through the door to the living room, just like they did every time Nikki Cox entered a scene. Just like goes on and on. At one point even, Tiffany's giving this like just funny over the top monologue and Ryan's in the scene with her, but he's like, don't I get to say anything? And she responds, no, you're just here so it doesn't look like I'm talking to myself. Like it was clever for its time, but very ahead of its time in that way.
Definitely. Like I am a sucker for meta network TV trope acknowledgement. One of my favorite things, I don't love the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air like most of our generation does. Like I thought it was kind of meh, but a lot of those shows we watched because they were on. But one of my favorite things there is there's like one season finale where Will decides he's going back to Philly, and like they're like, oh no, but you came to Bel Air because like it's a better life for you. So like that's how the season ends, and you're like, how do you have a Fresh Prince of Bel Air when he's back in Philly? So the very first scene of the season premiere is the NBC van pulling up, throwing him in, and driving him back to Bel Air. It's like I love stuff like that. So I loved when this show did it, but like I think one of his biggest strengths is the casting. I would say that Jeff Pearson, his Jack Malloy, out Al Bundy's Al Bundy. And maybe it's just an age thing, but like Al Bundy gets to be kind of like a cartoon after a while.
Yeah.
And I mean, this guy's like talking to a talking bunny, but like I got Jack Malloy. I understood Jack Malloy. I understood Tiffany. Tiffany is a character. She may have been inspirational. Tiffany's very dangerous, and we'll get to this in Jeers, in that like I feel like Levitt was pointing out something that occurred in society that people weren't really comfortable talking about. And I feel like you see Tiffany a lot more today in real life than you saw back then. It's like influencers are Tiffany Malloy. And like I said, in Jeers, we'll get into why. But the casting, Jeff Pearson, we're talking about how like most of those people haven't gone anywhere. Since that show, I have watched Jeff Pearson play senator after senator after senator.
Yeah.
And I see him and I'm like, you were Jack Malloy. Like it shows range, I guess, but he plays like the most boring, bullheaded dick senators, And it's like, you've got this comedic like edge to you. Why aren't you doing this? But like he was awesome in it. Stephanie Hodge, we've talked about how like you mentioned that apparently this show was developed as a vehicle for her when she left Nurses. I don't remember her on Nurses, and I watched every episode of that show. Like I remember later Nurses when they're like weaving people in and out, but there's nothing about Nurses where I saw Stephanie Hodge and thought, oh, that chick deserves her own show. And it becomes apparent here because she is quickly not the focus, but she does a great job of straddling that line, in that what I found interesting about their divorce is there's no one completely to blame. She's a terrible person, but so is he.
Yeah.
And it's one of those deals of like, yeah, Peg Bundy was kind of annoying, but all she really wanted was like her husband to have sex with her and to pay attention to her and keep her in bonbons. This woman, you don't know what she wants. She's only out for herself. She doesn't love her children. She doesn't love her husband. In the pilot, she's sleeping with her divorce lawyer when they had already agreed not to even bring lawyers into the equation. Off the bat, you're finding out who this woman is, and you're kind of like, why did she kick him out? Like, she's the one who sucks. But then you find out like he sucks in other ways and he's effective at it. Like Kevin Connolly is so effective at being a dunce that I couldn't take him seriously in Entourage years later, And like, I don't know who else could have been Tiffany Malloy. Like Nikki Cox. We kind of have to look at Nikki Cox the way that like our grandparents looked at Marilyn Monroe. There is this period of time where she was beauty. She was just it. And I mean, even when she wasn't trying, I remember she was on California Dreams as Sly's blind girlfriend. They made her a hot blind girl who wore no makeup and wasn't even trying. And you're like, oh wow. And then they just threw everything at her in Unhappily, and she ages like wine. I don't know if you noticed this, but she wears the same outfit in the series finale 5 years later that she wears in the pilot. And it lets you realize that like not only does she still have it, she's got it and more. It's amazing like what happened after that, like Jay Moore ruined my baby, but like prior to that she was immaculate.
She really was like 100%. I was tuning in because as a 13-year-old I'm like, she is hot, but then immediately I'm mesmerized by how funny she is. She's legitimately funny. She's not hot girl funny. And I feel
her
like
comedic timing is amazing.
Yeah, like Fran Drescher was the 90s version of Lucille Ball, but Nikki Cox was a close second. She was like right there because, like you said, she carries the whole show on her shoulders. I listened to interviews, I think it was on Jay Moore's podcast when they were married back in the day, and she talks about how like she loved Three's Company. John Ritter was like her ideal man. You know, Jack Tripper is who she wanted to marry. And so I think she was just studying sitcom timing and everything, and she had it down so perfectly. Because I mean, she was acting from the time she was tiny. Like you see her, she's in Mac and Me. I mean, I remember seeing her on an episode of Baywatch and all these things. She would just always show up here and there. She brings the laughs right until the end of the series. It's the same quality from her, and they don't dumb her down, and they don't dumb down the series. They don't write it like any differently, really. Like it's consistent in tone and characterization. Even Stephanie Hodge, yes, she leaves the series. Yes, she fades more and more into the background, but even when she's there, like she plays a great villain. I mean, that's really what she is. She's
you
just
love to hate her.
Yeah, I just think the cast is so strong. I'll say this. You mentioned Sable. They would always kind of have like a frenemy for Tiffany that would come in, and then so Ryan would hit on the girl and Tiffany would compete with her, but then they would team up sometimes or whatever. But my favorite was Barbara because she was just a little bit more sophisticated than Tiffany. And so she always seemed to have a slight edge on her, but then they would pull the rug out from under Barbara. And I thought she was awesome. So
she had more money. Like she was a rich girl, but she wasn't like, see, that's where we're getting into our like Betty and Veronica thing. Because I was watching today and I was like, why did they think Barbara could hold a candle to Tiffany? You know, like it's close but no cigar. I'm like nitpicking, like, she's hot for 95, but like, you know what I mean? So there was that formula. Frenemy, Ryan hits on, eventually Ryan gets, then they bring in a new girl.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We should mention too, this is just a little trivia, but I think a big part of why the show worked, that theme song really hooks you. You know, Hit the Road Jack. Everybody knows that song, right? Every couple of seasons, they would revamp it with the cast dancing and singing. But there was a theme song for the pilot that is different. And it's like an original theme song that actually Mr. Floppy is singing. So Bobcat Goldthwait sings the song. And the last scene of the last episode is Jack and Floppy on the couch playing that theme song one last time. And then the show's over. And it's just, it's not as catchy as what they went with, which really got you in the mood for the show every time. But it's still a very clever little song. So yeah, just for those who don't know that there actually was a lost theme song to Unhappily Ever After. All right, Will, can't all be laughs. Let's check out those jeers.
Boo! Boo! Boo!
Well, it didn't age well. Like, it is like the height of like not politically correct. From the pilot, we were talking about how Mr. Floppy reads the fan mail during the final credits. He uses what we now call the R word during the credits, answering one of those letters on the pilot. So that's like, buckle up. This is what you're about to get, you know? And another thing, I have to go back to, they don't love each other. They don't even like each other, but like the best you get is maybe a temporary truce backed by mutual respect, but there is no love in that family. And we weren't used to just downright bad people and like rooting for them. That was always the most jarring thing. I know I'm bringing in like other shows tonight more than I usually do, but that was the most jarring thing to me about the Seinfeld finale that I hated so much that I couldn't watch the show for the next 15 years, because that finale hinges on the idea that those four were horrible people over the course of that series, when it's kind of subtle. They're not bad, they're just self-interested. So they ended up screwing over a lot of people in order to achieve their own goals. So it was kind of like they hurt people as an afterthought. And I have always said that It's Always Sunny is Seinfeld done right, because out of the gate, you know that they're bad people, but that becomes part of the joke. We're never laughing at Seinfeld like, oh, wow, ha ha ha, he overslept and now that he's not going to run his marathon, or oh, Poppy's getting deported, or whoever the guy was. It's been a while, you know? But it's like, that was a side effect of what we were laughing at. But here we're supposed to laugh at horrible people and horrible people's misfortune with a laugh track telling us when to laugh. And I just don't think it plays well today. Like I said, I have laughed at horrible things, and I'm sure I laughed at it back then, but like watching it today, people love to say like, oh, you couldn't make Blazing Saddles today. Yeah, you could, but you can't make this show in its present incarnation in 2024.
Well, and I want to ask you this. Do you think because Ron Levitt, like the tonal shift from this, that's just basically I'm getting away with more than I could on Married with Children, like, is it for him parody and satire, or is he using it as a soapbox? Because it really feels like this is all the stuff I want to say and that I think is funny, and I want to see girls in bikinis all the time, and I want to call out all these shows that I dislike and I hate, because like, to me, like, we didn't talk about him in Cheers, Mr. Floppy is kind of the best thing and the worst thing. He's the Fonzie of the show. He's the guy who says the outrageous things you can't believe it, and he gets away with it because he's a little puppet that looks cute. But then he would often get too mean, picking on the celebrities or talking about how bad other TV shows were, because it was just like, we need to do this. And it felt like it was very petty and pandering at a certain point. It's like, this is the formula, so we do it, and we have to keep upping it. Like on Married with Children, Al would physically suffer at the sound of the Facts of Life theme song. Whenever that came on, he would start wailing, right? But he never broke the fourth wall to rant about how terrible Tootie and everybody else were on that show, right? Like, and this show, they break for 5 minutes at a time so that Mr. Floppy could do a stand-up routine just ripping apart the other shows that are in primetime. And it's too cheap and it's too easy. But that's what I'm wondering. Is it Ron Levitt just saying, I want to let it fly? This is what I've always wanted to say.
Yeah, I have two thoughts associated with that. So, first off, I definitely think it's a soapbox. And I think he softens the blow because of Mr. Floppy. It's the same way I was talking to my wife about this tonight, and it's revealing too much about me. But the psychological warfare of social media, how like you can say something real questionable if you just put an LOL after it or the right emoji. Mr. Floppy is the emoji. He lets the show get away with things, but also I kind of hate Mr. Floppy because like I don't know who else could have done it. Like Bobcat Goldthwait was like the perfect choice for that.
Yeah.
But he's emblematic of this thing that happened to shows, especially in that era, where you kind of have what's already a solid show, but they throw in this weird aspect as the hook, I guess, to like sell it to the network, where they're like, okay, how is this different from this show? Like one example that always bothers me, and it's a little after our time, but I've gone back and researched, That's So Raven on the Disney Channel. That's So Raven is a conventional tween, high school teen show in the vein of Saved by the Bell and all the rest of them. It could have been a fine show like that. You've got like a biracial lead instead of like your cute blonde surfer boy. Like it still approaches the same topics with different people, and that would have worked. But no, somebody decided, what if we gave Raven psychic powers? And you see, she doesn't really know how to control them. She doesn't know what these visions mean. We're going to give her these flash forwards, which will kind of dictate the plot. And then at the end, we'll find out that she completely misinterpreted her vision. But ha ha ha, hilarity ensued. They didn't need that. They could have just had Raven and her friends go to high school. And it's the same here. I think they could have done this show without Mr. Floppy, but it couldn't have been as mean. Like, he allows them to get away with more. But like I was saying about Tiffany's character, I feel a lot about the show the way I felt about She's With Me and Women in Prison. If we're talking about the Levitt Moy sort of situation, in that I always want to understand how many women were involved when they are tackling women. And my biggest issue with Tiffany is she uses sex to manipulate men. And it is a brazen thing. It's not subtle. And in the pilot, it's like this joking castaway kind of like satire thing of like her friends like, hey, you need to like roll in the hay with that guy because all the cool kids are doing it. And she puts forth, she says, no, like I'm not doing that. You know I'm a virgin. I'm saving myself for a really old crusty man with a lot of money who hopefully dies a week later. She is a conniving gold digger. And then, which is a question you can never ask in a show today. She is then asked, well, if you're a virgin, why do you dress like that? And she says, because I love the power.
Yeah.
And it's like the audience laughs and it's kind of like, ha ha ha. But then you think about it and you're like, what is Levitt saying about women here?
Yeah.
And like through that lens, because I didn't care when I was like growing up watching whatever. She's hot and she's smart. But looking back at it now, I'm like, this chick is an influencer. Tiffany Malloy has an OnlyFans. Say what you will, that's not a judgment call. I'm just saying that if this show were made in 2024, Tiffany Malloy would have a very successful non-nude OnlyFans. She would probably buy like pictures of other people's feet and pass them off as her own, you know? But it's like that made me uncomfortable, and it just kind of showed how much we have changed, because those thoughts are still out there. They're just held by people we don't respect right now.
Yeah, like the misogyny of it all is the problem, because what it is there are three, at least in the first two seasons, three representations of what Levitt thinks women are when they're young and hot and they're smart. And like Tiffany stays a virgin. I mean, she never breaks that. I mean, that's her thing. That's her power, like she says. So it's like women hold that over you, hot girls hold that over you, or whatever, right? And then you have Stephanie Hodges' character, Jenny, who now is like the bitter woman. She's gonna cheat on you and she just wants your money and she wants you to pay for everything for her. And then you had the mother-in-law, who again we mentioned briefly, and she comes in, she's just always high on pills. She just like rips him apart. She's old, she's ugly, she's crusty, like, and like, so that's what eventually the woman is going to become. And you're just like, the view of women as presented on the show now, again, you know, the dad is a drunk and a loser, Ryan is an idiot, you know, obviously Ross is maladjusted because of all of that, so everybody's terrible, but it definitely highlights, you know, the women as like the biggest problem, and that is brought up a lot. And again, Ryan's always hitting on girls in like the worst way. Like sometimes it's silly and stupid, but usually, and especially towards the end, it's really gross, the stuff he says.
It's the pickup artist idea that like it's a numbers game. Like near the end, Ryan just doesn't care who they are. It's just eventually one will say yes. But it also doesn't do a good job of delicately handling serious issues in that, okay, it's not that show. You're not going to have a very special episode of Unhappily Ever After. But one thing that struck me is the marketing for the show and all of the subsequent like descriptions of the show. They categorize Jack as a schizophrenic. Jack sees Mr. Floppy because he is a schizophrenic. It's not because he's lonely and depressed or that he's imagining all this like it's an imaginary friend for someone to talk to. They put that DSM-4 label of schizophrenic on him, and in the end it's just like, well, if he just takes his pills he'll be okay. But he decides he'd much rather be a schizophrenic and have a best friend than cure his mental illness. So he spits out the pills, cracks a beer, and the formerly dead Mr. Floppy is resurrected. And it's such a like, I get that Moy and Levitt come from the school of don't watch my show to learn life lessons, but you can't talk about First off, you can't even say schizophrenic anymore.
No.
It's like multiple personality disorder. It's all these other, it's like Moon Knight. Moon Knight, when he was created, was schizophrenic, and now he's not. He's everything but in the Marvel universe.
Yeah.
So just looking at that is just another example of why that show couldn't play today and why it's kind of cringe looking back on it.
Yeah, there's too many red flags. It's like for all the hits and the laughs, like there's an overwhelming amount of misses and cringes. So yeah, you just can't do it. So that being the case, we got to look at, if we're going to take the premise of Unhappily Ever After, if a network has the IP, they want to resurrect it, how can they do it? We're riding in on the ambulance as the show doctors. So I think what you were saying, Will, that the show ran its course by the end of the 90s. We weren't interested in this type of entertainment anymore. So yeah, we definitely have to reboot the show. We have to figure out, is there a skeleton here that you can still hang a show on today? So what do you think? What would you be doing a modern day Unhappily?
Well, I definitely agree that it had run its course, and you can tell because the episode count is exactly 100 episodes. Back during that era, for strip syndication is what we call 5 days a week. When they're like, hey, Saved by the Bell, 5 days a week. That's strip syndication. Back then, the minimum was 100 episodes. So you would find a lot of shows just limp across the finish line so they could get to that magic number of 100. And this is an example of that. I don't necessarily think the quality waned, but I think the world was changing.
Yeah.
So, but surprisingly enough, I don't remember this show ever making it to strip syndication. I feel like the material might have hampered that. Some shows can't bank on that. We hadn't gotten to the point of like Sex and the City, where like Sex and the City was filmed 2 different ways because they knew most of it wouldn't fly once it reached strip syndication. Like this show didn't have that to fall back on, nor did they seem to have the budget or willingness to edit it down. So it's like those 100 episodes were for naught. But for today, normally my show doctor's prescription is to throw it into syndication, but we don't have that anymore. And I'm not putting it on streaming because I don't trust that. What I would do, the same way I compared it to Sunny, I would put it on FX. I would put it on FX. I would take out the laugh track. It would be a single cam show, but we go in, like we market the hell out of it as far as like, hey, want to see a horrible family? Like, really, that's it, because people love a car crash. And, like, it'll be funny. We're not going to end on a note where it's like, oh, they really do love each other. You're going to walk away and you're going to wonder, do they love each other? I think maybe there was a glimmer there. You maybe dangle it a bit. But I mean, in this day and age, we're talking like a Sunny season right now is like 10 episodes and it airs in January. And then we don't see the show again till next January. It's not like they run those 10 episodes the whole year. It just disappears and they replace it with Archer season 29. And then the next January, here's Sunny again. It would be that kind of thing. Don't let it sit around long enough for people to get tired of it. Don't let it sit around long enough for some parent group to grab it when news cycles get slow. But I would keep it as crass. But I think one of the issues is the laugh track, because the laugh track tells the audience when they should be laughing, where if you take that out, it creates an interesting dynamic where if you're watching it with a friend and you happen to laugh when they don't, and then suddenly you got this Mexican standoff of like, oh, is our humor different? Like, is this friendship gonna work? Like that kind of deal. So I would keep the edge to it. I would just remove the laugh track and put it on basic cable. I don't have an idea of current casting because honestly, I love who they have. Hell, I would bring it back as a revival. I mean, they're all available when you really get down to it. So that's kind of where my head is with it.
Yeah, I always figure you are like the network head. You're the guy who's like, this is where we place it. This is how we put it together. I may be the idea man. I have a pitch here. You tell me if you like it, because I think it was like a bait and switch in the first season because they told us they're getting divorced. He moves out. He's got an apartment and the rest of the family is living in the house. But really by the second season, he's moved back in and they're back together and they stay married. Like, and then he doesn't live in that apartment anymore. His apartment is the basement set. So I was like, they kind of ripped us off on the divorce angle. And I think that is very relatable to everybody who's been born since the 70s. Like, where we're all children of divorce in some level, you know, it feels like. So I would want to lean into that, but I want to make it very surreal and stick with the meta side of it. Okay. So like we would have the kids splitting time between the different parents' homes. They actually do get divorced, but each time they're at one parent's home, it's a very distinct stylistic sitcom homage, and they're playing with those tropes. So for example, when they go to be with Jack, he doesn't take him to his apartment. They hang out in a bar that's like Cheers, and the kids end up learning life lessons from all the local drunks. Some of them have imaginary friends like Mr. Floppy, and there's the imaginary friends section of the bar, and whatever, you know, like, so it's just like this kind of weird situation, and you play into those tropes. But then when they're with Jenny, it's like the professional women making it on their own type sitcom now. So she's starting a business, it's Designing Women, or it's Murphy Brown, or I just feel like the other hook that we could give it, and we can decide if it works, it makes you feel like a divorced kid, is that 1 week, the show is a Jack episode. The other week, it alternates to a Jenny episode. So it's technically the same series, but you're literally being shipped back and forth between the parents. And I'm sure at some point they would decide, well, one of these is more popular than the other, and then they would just run with that. But at least at the beginning, I think it's an interesting hook to get people's attention. So that's where I'm coming from. I said, like, let's use the meta, let's use the mockery, let's use the outrageous humor, but let's really amp it up so you know it's a joke.
I like that. I like that a lot. And it also kind of explains away some of the issues I have with the existing show. For example, you were talking about how he has the apartment. He moves back into the house. He moves into the basement. Okay, he's in the basement. Stephanie Hodges' character dies. Then she's resurrected by the network. Then she runs off with her lesbian lover. He never moves out of the basement. It's like, this is your house now. Like, why do you still live in the basement? I don't know. Like, Full House was good about that. It's like, okay, Jesse took over Stephanie's room. Then he gets married. Then they build the studio in the basement. Then he gets married and moves to the attic because these people refuse to sign any lease or mortgage with their own names. But like, that's an important thing of like placing and setting and that kind of deal. Why are you still in the basement, Jack?
But hey, well, now that we finished talking about Unhappily, it's time that we make our way out of the basement and back into the world of pilots. So why don't you explain to us what is going on in our next episode?
Well, next time around, we're going to examine and explore an 80s animated pilot that was possibly ahead of its time and laid the groundwork for a massive franchise that dominated the 90s. That's right, we're talking about Marvel's first attempt to get their mutant heroes on TV in Pride of the X-Men. So stay tuned for our next episode.
That's right. So we are ready to roll on the X-Men. It's going to be a very fun conversation. Of course, everybody anticipating the release of X-Men 97, so we'll get that nostalgia flowing. But in the meantime, if people want to connect with our nostalgic and pop culture thoughts online, Will, where can they find you again?
They can find me on most social networks at William B. West or at my website, westweekever.com. I have a weekly segment, West Week Ever, Pop Culture in Review, where we look at the week that was in pop culture.
Yes, indeed. And you can find me on all the socials at Hoju Coolander, but also at theretronetwork.com, which is the home of Geekster, our parent network now. And I do want to say one of my shows there, Wizards, the podcast guide to comics. If you're not a comic book fan, maybe William Bruce West could just give you some thoughts, because he was recently a guest on episode 89 of the podcast over there, and we had a great conversation. He was back for our half episode where we were talking about some cool Batman stories. So if you want a little bit more of the Adam and William dynamic, then get on over there and check out Wizards, the podcast guide to comics. But until next time, we're changing the channel.
This has been a presentation of Geekster Media.